Okay, ready? You can go.
Right. So, yeah, Christian has asked me lately whether I can take that session, and well, I thought what topic to talk about, and it's going to be a bit more technical because it's about query folding, but no worries, I'll try to explain for you upfront what query folding is about, and I'm as well giving you some context maybe about my person. So I'm Rene Goris, working with Microsoft since 4 years now, and they are mainly in a role as a cloud solution architect for engineering, previously a premier field engineer and customer engineer. So mainly involved in technical discussions with customers around Power BI, around SQL databases, so that you understand my background a bit, right? Well, I thought about structuring it today a bit like this, that we first of all develop a common understanding of query folding in Power BI, that we understand the importance of query folding within that context, and of course a discussion about query folding without having some nice demos wouldn't be really useful. So I tried to keep that first part very short, and then we're jumping in to some demonstrations. And feel free whenever you think you have a question, where is burning, just interrupt and ask, right? Any comments maybe up front? Yes, I'm turning off that camera here now. Well, so basically some theory up front. So what is query folding? We all work with Power BI, I hope, and we all have extracted, let's say, multiple data sources. There are some data sources like CSV files or web APIs where it is a bit harder to get some query folding or some queries executed against or towards a data source. So query folding is basically that process where your Power Query, that you use to extract the data from your source, is translated into the language of your source system, and then querying your source system with that query. So what it actually does is it takes each and every transformation step within your Power Query statement and tries to assemble one piece of code. For SQL Server, for example, one piece of T-SQL code where it is executed against the SQL Server engine. Would be silly if you have to query each and every step. So because this would lead to some performance impacts, but I'm going to show you that as well a bit later. So what you see as well is that sometimes query folding at a certain point might be interrupted. So meaning you don't necessarily fold the whole query, but parts of that query. That's always a bit hard to say which steps are folding at all. It's kind of documented somewhere. So what you can say is, and I'm coming to that then as well a bit later, you can say heavier transformation steps. That's, for example, a query folding breaker. Let's put it that way. When we continue, where and why is query folding important? We have the import models, so we import data into Power BI. So there it is important to have some query folding enabled, because you don't want to do all the mashup within your mashup engine. That's a heavy operation if you would have to do all those transformations within the mashup engine, and that leads to some long-running transformation steps in memory. That's as well CPU intense. So it's something you typically want to avoid to have those large transformation steps in during import model even during import mode applied. Another good scenario is when you go, for example, for direct query or for the dual storage mode tables. Also there, query folding is helpful. There maybe even a bit more. There are also one or two things you should think of when you use direct query to get the most efficient query towards your source system. And last but not least, also for incremental refreshes, some proper query folding is efficient. Just imagine you're querying a large table with 500 million records from a CSV file, and then you're applying some date filters there. So little spoiler, CSV files are very bad in query folding. So there you basically have to read all these 500 million records into memory, and then you're applying the filters. So your incremental refresh is not going to perform very well if you do things like that. Just to give you some examples here, maybe let's look at the supported sources for query folding. So let's say most of the data sources that have the concept of a query language support query folding. SQL Server, for example, Oracle systems. To a certain extent, it works as well towards SharePoint. But there are as well systems where you can't apply query folding. Those that are not mentioned here, for example, web APIs.
Sorry, so you
yes?
state with SharePoint list, you can do query folding?
Sometimes, yes. There are some limitations, but it hands over some filters.
There is a REST interface, so clearly, so you can reduce the amount of data you retrieve, this yes, but not an automated way.
I didn't get that, sorry. Can you repeat it? Or
I mean, depending on how you set up your SharePoint list query, using the REST interface, of course, you can limit the amount of data you retrieve instead of retrieving everything and then filtering out things.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware that you can do it in a way that the query is doing the folding automatically.
Oh, no. But to a certain extent, it understands some filter predicates there.
I think it's just that you can't see it in the like a standard when you're working with SQL, the query itself. So you have to monitor the traffic like with some additional tools. And maybe there you will see that actually your filters and some transformations are translated, so to say, in a HTTP query. But you can't see it directly in Power Query.
Right. But in general, everything that understands, let's say, more or less some proper querying language is supported. It can be looked up as well on the learning pages, right? So there, it is also documented which of the data sources supports that to a certain extent, right? So if you look, for example, for all data sources or connectors that support direct query, then that's likely as well, supporting query folding. Right. Let's look maybe at the transformation steps. So that's a bit more interesting. Which transformation steps support query folding? Because there's something you should be a bit careful with. So, for example, transformations where you remove columns. I mean, that's basically like removing a column in a select statement. So that's pretty simple transformation. So that's just like removing that column, renaming some columns. To stick with the SQL example, that's like writing a statement in SQL. I would say, well, column A S or equals my initial column name. or you do it the way round, and then you have your initial column name as column A, for example. Yeah? So that's kind of possible. Filtering rows is possible. That's also folded towards the source. Grouping and summarizing is supported with query folding, and some other tasks. Join operations, for example, but don't use those fuzzy logic. Join operations use the normal join operators, I would have said, as an inner join, a left join, a right join. So operation, those statements are supported for query folding. Appending with union all operator is folded. Some custom column operations are supported. So, for example, if you add another custom column and with some specific logic where you would say, well, if there is some value within a certain column, then create that new column and state yes, otherwise all the other values are no. Might be a stupid example, but it's something like that, right? And then we have pivoting and unpivoting operators. So basically everything what is supported from your source system perspective as well is supported there. And now let's look into the more silly part, what might break query folding at a certain point, and where you should think of to shift those steps then maybe for the sake of longer lasting folding operations to the very end of your statement. So merging queries based on different sources, that's something that will prevent you from query folding. Now you can imagine if you retrieve some values from a SQL database and then some values are retrieved from a CSV file, and one of your very first steps in your Power Query is a merge of these two queries, and then you do a lot of other transformations, then you have that problem of shifting everything again towards your mashup engine there. So they are always try to do those steps maybe at the latest possible stage, and try to think of maybe as well separating those data sources, maybe kind of to that point where you can merge the results. I mean, typically Power Query is something pretty nice where you as well can copy some steps from one generic query and move them to another query. And if you have a small CSV file and a large SQL database table and you want to merge them and all the steps are identical, what you have to do, then it might be useful to merge them or to do a union operation at the very end, and apply all those transformation steps on both queries beforehand, because then you have a smaller query potentially being executed on one side and the other query gets folded a bit longer. Adding custom columns with complex logic might as well be something that prevents you from query folding. It's a bit cryptical. What is complex logic? Well, example I've mentioned before might not be that complex, right? To compare certain values, but if you compare the values between 4, 5, 6 columns there, you might end up with being prevented from query folding. So as well, when you change data types, that's also not supported for all the data sources. For sure, the best one to apply those changes is let's say always SQL Server. There you have the least limitations, but with other data sources, you might hit a wall there already when you change a data type. Now the biggest question is, how can you check that query folding happens? So basically, when you look in Power Query, editor. On the right-hand side, where you have all your applied steps, there is something small called View Native Query, and that will show you, if you see that typically, besides some, I think there are 2 or 3 connectors where you don't see the native query, but it creates a native query. Like mentioned before, sometimes you really have to look on the source system side and check which query, sorry, which query has been checked, sent to the source system to see whether query folding was applied or not. But that native query, if you see it there, gives you already a good idea of whether it has been applied or not. Maybe some of you are working with data flows. There it's even a bit visualized a bit more fancy, because there I take the red pen, but there you have a green line here that shows you to which extent query folding is applied to your transformation steps. There you have a database symbol next to that green line that should symbolize that query folding is applied to that particular step. So normally you won't see that with all what I said. No, you won't see it maybe with all the queries. So and what happens is now I lost track a bit. Native queries. So that's something what I see as well a couple of times with someone in with maybe specifically in the IT department provided someone or some user a SQL statement and said, hey, here's the SQL statement. Execute that towards my SQL database and put that native query. There you have to be cautious as well. Those queries typically don't fold if you just put them there. So you see, you have to use some specific M code again to get those things folded. And again, if you want it to be folded, don't use highly complex statements there, like common table expressions on SQL Server. That again would prevent you then from folding. So, and that's basically already all what I wanted to show. And now, just to give you an idea of what I wanted to demo, so I wanted to go a bit in some details with Power BI Desktop, show you there how you can figure out whether query folding is applied or not. Then we're looking into some direct query scenario and the join operations, how you can optimize them there with some tweaks. Also all those direct query statements are query folded. And then last but not least, I wanted to show you something with some CSV file and how you can optimize the workload there. Okay, let me switch to the desktop presentation. If you have any questions, meanwhile, feel free to ask. Wait, this was the wrong one. That was the wrong one. There we go. Also, in Power BI Desktop, as I mentioned, I'm a little fan of SQL Server, so I'm going to connect to some SQL Server database up front. So I would connect to the AdventureWorks database here, and first in import mode, then later we come back to that scenario and we connect to. So, and then we come back to that scenario and we look into the direct query option as well. So just picking one random table here, get all the related tables. especially with relational databases, that's a nice feature. And we are looking into that then as well a bit later when it comes to direct query mode. Because if your system detects the related tables, there is one important thing what most of the users don't check in their queries. Oh, bit later. I'll show you that. So now let's transform the data here. And right, Power Query came to the other screen. So now what we see is all of our tables here related, and at the end we get as well all the dimension lookups here again. So let's look into the native query here quickly. What happens is initially that query looks like this. The good thing is if you have on a relational database query store enabled, already from that standpoint, it's always pretty easy for users or for your database administrators to identify the Power BI workloads, because they always use this crazy looking aliases here. So it's pretty easy to filter out all those queries that were related to Power BI, maybe even more for there is nothing really written in that it was a Power BI query somewhere in Query Store or else there. That's already very helpful. Now, what I wanted to do is basically wanted to maybe remove some information here. Like maybe I'm not interested in the revision number here, and for our use cases, maybe also not interested in some of these columns here at the end. And when we do that, we see is our native query that still looks pretty much similar. So we would have to compare it with the navigation now. You see they just disappear, those columns. Now it might be a bit more interesting to kill all those relations here. This is just looking bad. So now we are in a nice state here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just adding maybe some group by. So I would have this painful way of grouping and then going to advanced. Maybe not so cool. So what else could I do? Maybe to make things a bit easier, I shift my date columns here to the front. And all the other stuff is quantities. So, and maybe I want to sum up all that stuff behind. So now I have the columns here. What I could do is and group that stuff by, and then I have all the elements that I wanted to group by. You're already selected in the advanced editor. So now the only thing what I would have to do is, let's say, I do some sum here for one of the or some of the columns, and well, of course you can call the order quantity then as well, order quantity, and that's it. And then we look again into our native query here, and you see that's basically the select statement that has been created by Power Query. I could basically go to Management Studio now here and execute that query here as well. So, and that's going to be the data what Power BI will ingest into its model. So now I would have that option of doing that. So Let's apply the changes here. And that's some lightweight operation what we are doing here. Can you imagine every step what we are taking here is folded and sent towards my SQL database. So there is not a lot of things that impact my performance on my model here. And at the end of the day, it looks like this. Never understand. Only problem what we now have is that date dimension is not related, and of course there would be like 50,000 other options here to combine the date with another date column. But that's roughly how it works in Power BI Desktop. So we've seen there we mainly have to check through the transformation steps to see whether something is folding. And now let's basically go to the advanced editor here, copy that statement, and then what we can do is we go there and we create a new data flow. I want to create a data mart now. That's something I wanted to do later. And then we add some new tables here. Hope my gateway works. Questions?
Questions so far?
We just paste my copied statement somewhere, because the first thing I need is the database. So, next. And now, which one did we take? Fact internet sales here. I have again all the related tables. And now, just to showcase this quickly, and now I could basically take this Power Query statement, and I can't take the Power Query statement at the same time without editing it probably, because you see what Power BI Desktop does looks a bit different compared to what Power Query does. So just check. I have to take it from here. And then here we have to point to navigation 1. And that's all. And then it should then it should basically work. And then you see here on the right-hand side this green line. And you see all the steps here from the very top to the very bottom are applied against your source system. So whenever you feel like you have 25 transformation steps and you have an enterprise gateway in place, data flow might be a nice option to check where the query folding breaks. Always depends on whether you want to click here on each step or whether you want to get it visualized. Same thing is basically here. So you could basically view the plan here. So you see that sends basically this query to data source. So I'll just check quickly what I wanted to, whether I've forgotten something here. I think that's it on the first demo. So next thing what I would like to show you is, now you remember, or just keep in mind this model here. All the data is imported here. Bad thing is you can't really reverse that. Would be easier. But now I'm going to show you why this field is potentially as well of importance, especially when you deal with larger data volumes. Yeah, this could really become a bottleneck.
Rene, may I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm not an expert as you are, but as far as I understand it, so the query folding is the way Power BI gets the data from the source.
Mm-hmm.
But to the best of my knowledge, we as users have little influence on that, right? It's automatically done by Power BI. Or do I understand it wrongly?
Right. Also it should be basically something to to give you some context and some background maybe on how Power BI works here, right? So
right. Because we cannot override how I understand that the way a query is executed has an influence on the performance, but we cannot override the automatic generated folding mechanism, can we? Or
right? No, that's exactly, you can't override it. The thing is, for example, that's why I'm in the third part. It's going to be a bit more interesting then in the third demo when I talk about the CSV file. So because there I'm going to show you how things can go wrong in a CSV file, but how you can, for example, then leverage from a data mart where you import the data into a SQL database and get exactly what you see here. So it's really just like I tried to connect all the dots there a bit, but let's say we're only halfway here. Right? And especially now when you work with relational databases, there's one thing when you go for direct query and you want to execute your queries all the time against the data source. There are some small, let's say, checkboxes you have to click, I would say, to get some more query performance out of the box. Because most of the data bases are designed in a way that the whole data model is has relationships with each table. So I have some relationship with currency and internet sales and so on. So there are some relationships in place where Power BI can leverage from. So now when I close that here, so now I'm not doing any transformations here. I just leave the model as it is. And now when I basically using that model here, there are some things we have to keep in mind. So we have relationships between all the tables. Those relationships are all active. That's all nice and all fine. But you might see as well in all the models you're using another field here that is called assume referential integrity. And whenever you feel that your database administrators in your organization do everything right, feel free to click this box here. Because typically gives you better query performance, simply spoken, because it will assume that the values you have here also exist in that database. So if there was one product key in that database, which doesn't exist here in your model or in your query, what you send, how would you say? No, in your report page, sorry, now I have the right words. In your report page, when the value that exists here doesn't exist in your dimension table and you filter from the dimension table towards that table, what happens? You get a blank field in Power BI displayed. So this basically means there are entries in that table that do not exist here. typically, on a proper designed model, that shouldn't exist, this case. And that's why we can assume referential integrity everywhere. I'm not assuming it now for all the columns, so just have to keep in mind that I did it for product and customer. And now what happens is, let's query sales amount here in a table. And then let's add the customer dimension here. What are we interested in? Maybe in the last name. So now we are basically sending a SQL statement towards, also to the SQL engine to retrieve these values. So how does that SQL statement look like? I don't know yet, but I'm gonna find it out here and check. So basically, I have to be a bit careful here. That's basically the DAX statement where they send when we copy that part. And this is basically here below the direct query statement where they send against my database. Now what you see is one important thing here. That's this keyword called inner join. And when we do something like this, that way, I have to excuse myself already a bit. It's getting very technical now, but so then when we do this, we get an execution plan that is pretty much efficient. So we have an inner join, we have a relationship between these tables, so that all works fine. Of course, we retrieve all the data there. Now, the bad thing, what happens if we don't do that, it's the following thing. I used customer, right? Then we stick with the customer and we remove this assume referential integrity again. And now, of course, it's not really slower here on that case. See, it's taking like 81 seconds, milliseconds instead. But just think of a larger database, and there this might already be a big pain. And here it does a left outer join, so it would basically return all the values from that internet sales table, or all the last names and the sales amount. And wherever it doesn't find a last name in the other table, it would return you that blank value. And when we look at such an execution, sorry, the DAX statement on the top. So now it should work. So you see, it looks slightly different. We didn't look into these timings here. Something you would do when you deal with SQL Server, but this query is, trust me, a bit slower. So you get another join operation here compared to the inner join before. So that's something you should be aware of, especially in terms of modeling. As for you, it's basically just a small checkbox, but for the query engine, it's something huge. Does that make sense to everyone? So, and that's basically the trick there, what we have to think of. Then one last, or what two smaller things what I wanted to share with you or show you is,
excuse me, may I just share a funny thing about query folding? Is that
sure.
When you try to merge two SQL tables with inner join, for some reason, the step of merging queries is not folded. But if you try to expand, then the next step is folded. But with left outer join, it works. So
Okay.
I don't know why, but it happens. I don't know if it's a bug or if it's intentional on Microsoft side, but something that I've noticed when merging.
I've not yet investigated on that, but it sounds interesting and more like a feature. Right. So What I wanted to show you here, or as one of the last things, is when you import CSV files, what you typically have is you have let's say some CSV files here. I just prepared some random table here that you know how much records are in. That's something we'll see after loading it. As soon, or not as soon, but as long as you're loading that data without any transformation, that's totally fine. That's fast. If I click apply now here, you'll see processes this 20 megabytes and the data is loaded after some time. So, and we've seen it's like 350,000 records. So now, again, I'm in that situation where I say, well, why do I expose each and every record number here? Let me delete that. And then, well, let's see. This looks like a lot of records what I have to expose. Let's try to group by here. And then let's say here I put value 1 again, summarize it with value 1, and then I have another summarization here, and that's basically my value 2. So I'm just trying to get that data compressed. So what I forgot basically is to use the task manager in the previous step, but something. So here we have the task manager. And when we look for Power BI desktop, where is it? No, the mashup engine is maybe here. And so when we problem is I have 2 or 3 desktop sessions open, but all the mashup containers are pretty small here. Let me just close all the other sessions basically then. But so when we do this grouping, what will happen is you see that here at the bottom, it will take some time, then we're done. Now, if I apply that, it will still show me that it processes all these files, but my mashup container is growing way, way larger. So I use way more resources to do that grouping than before. Something you should keep in mind, especially if you're not loading one file, but for example, 15 files, then this could become really a bottleneck if you import data from a container. And of course, how can you work around that, Christian? How many time do we have?
Well, it's 6, usually close at 6, but I would say 5-10 more minutes is okay.
Okay, then I'll go to Power BI now. This keyboard here has as well. So now how can we mitigate this issue basically? So we have seen the SQL data and MySQL server before that works wonderful with query folding. So basically there should be some tool within the Microsoft ecosystem what helps me with this as well. And that's basically, for example, a data mart, right? There I can discard it. I can get some data as well from that same CSV file, store that in a SQL database, and then I can connect to that SQL database and do all the further transformation. So the thing is, but I don't see the CSV files. Here they are. So I need the directory for that here. Oh, file location. Was not the best idea to click there. So that's fine. Path we have. Next. Now we should soon see the CSV file that we can select. So we have to mention the file name. So let's copy it. The other option would be as well to upload the file, then it is somehow stored in SharePoint. So now, one thing, if I do this, that's fine, then I save everything. Yeah? So again, if I would do this the same like before in Power BI desktop and do something like this, I end up with the same situation. The cool thing is, that's why I'm doing that step quickly. Here you see the memory utilization visualized a bit better. That's why I'm doing it. So now when we click OK here, you'll see here you see the memory consumption going up to 300 or 350 megabytes. So it's a lot of memory what you consume for this small transformation. Always keep in mind it's just a 20 megabyte CSV file. So this way we would apply all the transformation steps within the engine and store that stuff afterwards compressed. The other option would be to do this and this. Just store the data here. I hope this time it works, hopefully. And then once this data is loaded, just duplicate that one here to get the URL. So what we basically need for the next step is from the data mart here. We need the address for the SQL endpoint, and that's stored here. And so we are done. Our data is loaded and stored in that data mart or in that database here. Now what I can do is within Power BI, save. I just imported here for the sake of the easiness here. I can connect to my data mart here. And I can connect to the SQL endpoint. And then load the data from that SQL endpoint into my model. Especially if you have a lot of different web sources, web data sources with APIs and so on, that might be a useful step you can apply in between. So, while that is loading, if someone have some questions? Silence means no.
I see no questions in the chat. No.
So, silence means no.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to read one of the file. I already reported this to Christian 2 weeks ago. It was CSV file. It was around 35,000 line. And yeah, when I tried to do it, I went with 2 hours after because I was treated this as it was shitty CSV file. The data, it was messy and need to be treated and the data around 20K line. So yeah, and at the end I did it with Python. So I tried to do it via Power BI, the same steps. It's straightforward steps, but the memory consumption, yeah, I was not able.
So maybe this is a solution. To use the data
the
mart
file is, yeah, but the file is really mess. So
Hmm?
to do it this, even I was not able to save the file in SQL. Yeah, if I did it in SQL, because
Okay.
even I think if I try to do it with PI service, I also.
Okay. So
But thanks for this tip. Yeah, I like it.
especially if you have as well API calls and so on to do, that's maybe really something worthwhile where you can store data in between. Just think of it as a small data warehouse, what you apply there.
Yeah.
Good.
Any further questions? Doesn't look like. So in such a case, Rene, thank you very much. I'm gonna just take over from here. Second. There we are. So thanks very much. I hope it's clear. Power BI query folding is not always an easy topic, but an important one. Why is it so useful to send all the transformation back to the data source? And probably if you have multiple transformation steps, it's always the best idea to do those steps that you can do at the beginning. So the query folding steps at the beginning, and afterwards then, if you have steps that are still needed but not query folding enabled, that you do that at the end as well. All right, then with that, as usual, just as a reminder for the next meetups, we will run it still on a first Thursday of the month base from 4 till 6 p.m. in the evening. The next one is planned on the 6th of April, online this time, not in hybrid one. And we will have two really great speakers. Ted Pattison from the Power BI customer advisory team. He will talk about building multi-language reports. He created a tool which will make the life a little bit easier to create such kind of tools. Really awesome. So stay tuned, join us. And if you wish to have a sneak peek what we're going to talk about, he published a few weeks ago a blog post about it, linking to his GitHub repo. This is what he's going to present. So if you wish, I added the link in the slide. And we will have Matthias to talk about deployment in Power BI, so probably as well a topic for Credit Suisse. There are some news coming, and I hope Matthias will be able to talk about it in April. Just to announce it right away, the next hybrid meeting, so in person in the circle as well online, will happen on June, but we do not have fixed a date yet, right? Because
we have a surprise.
Yes, we have a little surprise. A really great speaker is planning to come, but we couldn't agree on the date so far. So probably it will not be the Thursday of June, probably the 2nd or 3rd. We will check before speaker, right? But stay tuned, just that you know. And as usual, some useful links at the end. And with that, I say thank you very much in the name of Dennis and myself as his co-host for being with us today a little bit longer than usual. But still, thank you. And I hope to see you then next month again, at least online.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Christian. It's amazing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
All right, then. Thank you, everyone. I will close the
Thank
call.
you all. See you.
Right. And meeting.